Welcome to Friday Night Games. I'm JComX. Super Mario, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, Castlevania, Mega Man. What do all of these iconic franchises have in common? They all got their start on this little guy, the Nintendo Famicom.
So, you were just ignoring the fact that you produced no content in months and come back and act like everything is normal?
That's right. Today we're talking about another one of the watershed moments in Nintendo's history, the creation and launch of Nintendo's first bombshell home console. So what is the Famicom? Well, you may know it under its American name, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. This bad boy was a home video game and computer console that revolutionized gaming as we know it, revitalized the American video game industry in the mid-80s, and introduced the world to so many cherished game franchises. But it didn't just pop out of thin air. Where'd it come from? Who made it? Who are you and what's your f***ing problem? Get out of my house! Sit back and relax. All of your questions will be answered in this episode of Friday Night Games, the launch of the Nintendo Famicom. So, you want to know about the Famicom, huh? Where do we even begin? These days, the launch of the Famicom is considered one of the quintessential moments in gaming, especially in Japan. It's easy to look at these primitive, pixelated graphics and think, this is where it all began. But the Famicom wasn't created in a vacuum. In fact, it wasn't even Nintendo's first home console. You see, video games as we know them today mostly began with the rise of arcades and arcade games in the early 1970s. One of the first major video game hits was a little game called Pong. It's pretty obscure, you probably haven't heard about it. This simple game was essentially a digital version of everyone's favorite college game, beer pong. But with no beer. Aww. Sober as it was, everyone went nuts for this game. And then BAM! Capitalism. Atari, the company who had distributed Pong for arcades, even though they kind of stole the idea from another home console called the Magnavox Odyssey, made a home console version of Pong. Back in the day, you didn't need a personality if you had f***ing Pong in your house. Needless to say, it made tons of money, so Atari went full tilt into the home gaming market and in 1977 released one of the most iconic and successful retro video game consoles ever, the Atari VCS, better known as the Atari 2600, or the one that looks like wood paneling on an old car. Even though the Magnavox Odyssey came first, many consider this to be the real beginning of home gaming, and how could you not? Look at these beautiful graphics. Just kidding, I love this hunk of junk. But of course, when a company becomes successful, the invisible hand of the market guides other well-intentioned competitors to producing better goods for lower costs, allowing us consumers to reap the benefits of regulation-free competition. I'm just kidding. Tons of companies flooded the unregulated game market with a bunch of shitty games just to make a buck. By the end of 1983, most people in the US had become disillusioned with video games and the North American video game market crashed. For the next few years, Americans thought home console video games were dead and gone. Fortunately for Nintendo, video games were still alive and well in Japan. In the late 70s, Nintendo dipped their toes into the home game console market with the Color TV game series, developed by the newly formed Research and Development 2, or R&D 2, an offshoot of Nintendo's Research and Development division. Those were the folks responsible for Nintendo's early arcade games like Sheriff and Backgammon or some shit. The Color TV game series was full of original games such as Pong and Breakout and... wait, what the fuck? Yeah, these were basically just rip-offs of other games, but they were cheap, so they sold like hotcakes, giving Nintendo the confidence to keep going with this home console idea. In 1980, Nintendo struck gold once again with their handheld line of games, the Game & Watch. I freaking love the Game & Watch. You can tell because I've made 7 videos about it and counting, so go watch them. It'll tell you more than you ever wanted to know. Needless to say, the Game & Watch was a massive success for Nintendo. It was during this time, while Nintendo was riding high on the success of the Game & Watch, that the president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, drunkenly called up one of the guys from R&D 2 who had worked on the Color TV game series, Masayuki Uemura. In his drunken state, Yamauchi told Uemura, the Game & Watch won't last forever, and Uemura would be in charge of creating Nintendo's next big thing, a home computer console that could play interchangeable video game cartridges based on their arcade games. Oh, and he also wanted it to be cheaper than the best-selling home console in Japan, and it had to be advanced enough to hold off the competition for 3 years, and it all needs to be done by the middle of the following year. Oh, is that all? Pfft, f***ing easy. Apparently, this wasn't the first time Yamauchi had called Uemura drunk with a proposal because Uemura didn't take it too seriously, but he agreed to do it anyway since he wasn't working on anything. It wasn't until the next day when Yamauchi found Uemura to double-check that he was working on the project when Uemura realized he actually needed to do this impossible thing. Needless to say, this was a monumental task for Uemura, so Uemura began calling every electronics company he could think of, but none of them knew what the hell he was talking about. Fortunately, he got a call from Ricoh, an electronics company who happened to be looking for someone to make use of their new state-of-the-art semiconductor factories. Uemura agreed to take a tour of their facilities and ran into Hiromitsu Yagi, who had worked with Uemura to create the circuits for the Color TV game series. He told Uemura all about a new advanced chip Ricoh had just licensed called the 6502, which was smaller than the Z80 chip most arcade game makers in Japan were familiar with. It was exactly what Uemura was looking for, a cheap, relatively obscure yet advanced microchip that would help him stay ahead of the competition. The only problem was, even the developers at Nintendo didn't know how to use it. Notably, when Uemura told his staff they were going to use the 6502, they said, "You only make such decisions because you don't make video games." Well, by this point, Donkey Kong had been released to arcades and was a worldwide hit for Nintendo. Naturally, Uemura asked Yagi if the 6502 chip would be able to play a home port of Donkey Kong. When the other Ricoh engineers heard the idea, everyone jumped on board the project, excited at the idea that they would be able to play Donkey Kong at home. Yamauchi was notoriously stingy, and so in order to get a great deal, he told Uemura to make an unprecedented purchase of 3 million microchips. Everyone thought he was crazy, but Yamauchi really believed in the home console market and took the risk. Meanwhile, Nintendo got a visit from Coleco, a toy manufacturer, who showed off their latest home game console, the ColecoVision. The ColecoVision blew R&D2's minds. This wasn't no Atari 2600, these graphics were smooth as butter. Well, at the time. After that, R&D2 set a benchmark for their console to surpass the ColecoVision. Two R&D2 engineers, Tatsuka Nakakawa and Masahiro Otake, took a Donkey Kong arcade cabinet to Ricoh in order to analyze how to use the 6502 chip to reproduce it. They ultimately decided if they wanted advanced graphics like the ColecoVision, they would need to add an additional microchip to the console, specifically for processing images. Of course, they needed to have something to control the games. At the time, joysticks were the obvious choice for arcades, and they tested out many different variations, trying to get it just right. However, one engineer, Takao Sawano, suggested using the D-pad that had been invented for the Game & Watch version of Donkey Kong. They tested it out and realized it was a perfect match. They also decided to include 2 action buttons on the controller. Yeah, okay, that's enough to play Donkey Kong, I guess, but man, 2 buttons? I guess you gotta cut costs somewhere. On the Player 1 controller, they also had a start button for beginning the game and a select button for swapping between game modes. On the Player 2 controller, they added a microphone for reasons. Finally, the controllers were hardwired into the console, once again in order to save costs. I foresee no issues with this choice. Even though Yamauchi wanted the console to be as cheap as possible, Uemura still wanted it to have the capability to expand in the future, so he added an extra port on the front for things like a keyboard and other peripherals. As for the color scheme, Yamauchi chose this cream and scarlet design because they were the colors of his favorite scarf, and he saw a billboard with the colors and thought it looked classy or some shit, I don't know. That still left them with the issue of a name for the device. Uemura was talking about it with his wife, and she suggested instead of calling it a personal computer or pasokon, like a typical Japanese home computer, they should call it a Famicom, or family computer, and the name stuck like glue. By the way, shout out to the women working behind the scenes. They usually don't get much mention in the history of Nintendo, but I wonder how many of Nintendo's ideas came from conversations just like these. Even Gunpei Yokoi helped with the ultimate design of the Famicom. Ever the toy maker, Yokoi's notable contribution was an eject button on the console that would pop the cartridge out of its slot. It was completely superfluous, but Yokoi suggested that kids would enjoy playing with the button. And damn it if he wasn't right! Popping the cartridge out undoubtedly adds to the Famicom's charm. Understandably, the only part of Yamauchi's original instructions that Uemura wasn't able to follow was that it took 2 years to create the Famicom rather than 6 months. Well, I guess he can't have everything. In the end, R&D2 were asked to create a home video game console with a chip their programmers had never used, with input devices that had never been produced before, and with games based on their most popular arcade hits. And you know what? They actually pulled it off! And on July 15th, 1983, the Nintendo Family Computer was released in Japan. Isn't that such a cool freaking story? I had no idea about Masayuki Uemura before I started researching this video, but now I feel like he's one of the main characters of early Nintendo. Up there with the greats like Shigeru Miyamoto, Gunpei Yokoi, and Satoru Okada. Now, unfortunately, I'm not made of money, so I don't have a real Japanese Famicom. Help a guy out and subscribe, would ya? But I do have a Famicom Mini that I can show you. Check this out. Look at how adorably tiny it is. Even the controllers are tiny, and they're even hardwired into the console, just like the original Famicom. They fit perfectly into the slots on the sides. I really like the color scheme too. It's easier to appreciate in person, and it makes it a lot more lively than the black and gray of the NES. It looks so fancy. It's a great little decoration piece, and I love being able to see what a Famicom would look like in person, even if it is a mini version. Unfortunately, the eject button and the microphone on the second controller don't work, but other than that, this is really cool. Alright, so we know the story behind the Famicom's creation, but how does this thing actually work? We've talked about 6502 chips and chips for processing images, but what does that mean? Well, let's talk about microprocessors for a second.
Is that so? You want to take but a moment and explain the entire fundamentals of how computers function?
Yes, and I'm gonna do a terrible job! Yeah, okay, so I'm not like a freaking expert, but like... whatever, man. I like learning about how these old consoles work. It helps me gain a better understanding of what these developers and engineers were doing back in the day. And also take everything I say with a heaping helping of salt. So let's jump in. Let's start with the very basics. A microchip starts with a flat piece of silicon. Silicon is a super common element that's kinda like metal, but not really. It's important because it conducts electricity, but not too much electricity, hence the term semiconductor. Which is good because you don't want electricity zapping all over the place in your microchip, you just want little elegant bits of electricity communicating to each other. Microchips work by using tons of tiny little on-off switches called transistors, which send signals along pathways called circuits, both of which are embedded directly onto the silicon. You can represent these signals or bits with ones and zeros, 1 if on and 0 if off. This is called binary. Using binary, you can create a list of instructions you want the microchip to perform. Like for example, if I input 01000101, that's the command to add two numbers together. Except microchips are super freaking fast, and they can send like a million bajillion signals every microsecond or some crazy shit like that. All of those signals being sent can eventually result in you seeing a moving image on a screen. Now, if we zoom out of a microchip, we see that it has connectors. Those connectors are how the microchip communicates with the outside world. Using circuits, they can connect to other devices, like other microchips, speakers, or monitors. When it comes to the Famicom, you need many different microchips all working together. Some of these chips are inside the console, while others are inside the game cartridges. The Famicom has two main processing chips. The first one is the 6502 CPU chip we talked about earlier. This one acts like the Famicom's brain, telling the other chips what to do, and also contains the audio processing unit, which controls the sound and music. The second one is the picture processing unit, or PPU chip. This chip is responsible for controlling how to manipulate and display the graphics for the games. Both of these chips have their own dedicated little RAM chip, or random access memory chip. RAM chips are essential in running computers because they store memory for quick and easy access. Without RAM, computers would run extremely slowly or not at all. However, they can only store memory when power is being supplied to them. If you turn the power off, then all the memory is erased. Unfortunately, this is the 80s and RAM is very expensive. So in order for Nintendo to save cost, these RAM chips are only capable of holding 2 kilobytes of memory each. For reference, this image of Jumpman is 18 kilobytes, 9 times the entire amount of the Famicom's RAM. Meanwhile, inside the game cartridges we have 2 more chips. Both of these chips are ROM chips, or read-only memory chips. ROM is different from RAM because it can store memory permanently even without power, and it's cheaper, but it runs a lot more slowly. The first chip is the program ROM, which holds all of the information about the game mechanics and communicates directly to the Famicom's CPU chip. The second chip is the character ROM, which holds all of the images for the game. This chip communicates directly to the Famicom's PPU chip. Those are the 2 basic chips inside a Famicom cartridge. However, because of how little memory was inside the console, many games would expand beyond the limitations of the Famicom by adding additional ROM or RAM chips inside of the cartridges, along with mapper chips, which could change how the chips interact with the Famicom, even bypassing some of them. So whenever you turn a Famicom game on, the CPU and PPU will take the information from the ROM chips and store it for quick access in the RAM. That way it doesn't need to always access the slower ROM chips. As for the graphics, the Famicom draws everything using 8x8 pixel wide boxes called tiles. For the Famicom, each pixel used 2 bits for each color. This means 4 levels of brightness for red, green, and blue for a total of 64 possible colors, but each tile could only use 4 colors at a time, and one of those colors was always transparent. That's why Jumpman's image is made up of only 3 colors, with the area around him being transparent. Every pixel on the screen can be interpreted as a number value. This is how game developers would program images for games. They would have to input a number for each pixel and tile on the screen, which was very time-consuming. That's why back then, game developers would draw everything on graph paper first, and then input all of the code afterwards. It was much cheaper and easier to make mistakes on graph paper than having to recode everything. Developers were also very limited on how many graphics they could make. Because the Famicom only had 2 kilobytes of RAM, it could only store 128 image tiles for the whole game. Character animations, enemies, everything. Here's what Donkey Kong's pattern table looks like. This table holds all of Donkey Kong's images. You can see that Mario and Donkey Kong take up a huge chunk of the images just for their own animations. Because of this limitation, every image had to be carefully selected, and oftentimes developers would use palette swaps or mirroring to make the same image look like 2 different things. Once the developers finished the game's code, written in a sort of human-readable language called assembly, their computer program would use a cross-assembler to translate the game's code into binary, so it could be stored on and understood by the cartridge's ROM microchips. Alright, so let's take a look at the whole process. First, you put your game cartridge in and you turn the power on. The CPU wakes up and begins telling the other chips what to do. It checks with the cartridge's program ROM, which tells it to display the title screen. So the CPU tells the PPU to pull the title screen images from the character ROM. They both load their respective information into their RAM chips for easy access, and the title screen is displayed. You press the start button on your controller and the CPU checks with the program ROM. That tells it to start the game. The CPU tells the PPU to pull the images for the first level. So the PPU loads the images from the RAM and sends the signal to display level 1 on your TV screen. All of this is happening in the blink of an eye, and before you know it, you're playing Donkey Kong. Whew, and that is my perfect, not flawed in any way explanation of how the Famicom works. And that is enough of that. What are we, in school or something? Sheesh!
ファミリーコンピューターにエキサイトバイクゲームになったアイスクライマーを持ったディスクカードを使うとドラマチックなゲーム内容に
Hello? Anyone need their pipes cleaned? No, but I need one now! Now, when the Famicom was unveiled to the Japanese public in 1983, it had 3 games: Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Obviously, the big system seller was Donkey Kong. I mean, it was Nintendo's most famous game, and the console was practically tailor-made to play it. Naturally, this gave it a huge advantage over other home versions of Donkey Kong. Compare it to some of the other options at the time. Here's Atari's, attempt? Here's the ColecoVision port. This one's actually not too shabby, but when you set it next to the Famicom version, there's no contest. Sure, the Famicom Donkey Kong was still missing the cement factory level, and the aspect ratio was squished in order to fit a TV screen, but it was far and away the best home version of Donkey Kong. Even today, this is probably my favorite way to play the original Donkey Kong, aside from playing on an actual arcade cabinet. Donkey Kong Jr.'s Famicom conversion was even more impressive than Donkey Kong's. This is pretty much the same experience as playing the game in the arcade, aside from the difficulty level and colors. It's still missing a few details like the cutscenes, but it has all 4 levels and it's a great way to play the game. Of the 3 launch games, unfortunately Popeye gets the raw end of the deal. It's definitely the least accurate version with worse visuals and missing gameplay mechanics from the arcade. But hey, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, and I don't think many people were buying a Famicom to play Popeye. Unfortunately, all was not smooth sailing for the Famicom after its launch. In fact, it had a pretty rough first year. For one, it had competition. The same day the Famicom launched, another console was making its debut. Sega, a rival arcade game company, released the SG-1000, their first foray into the market alongside the Nintendo Famicom. While the Famicom had only 3, albeit very accurate arcade conversions, the SG-1000 had 12 games on launch day, and they were overall a more well-known arcade company. Not knowing the future of these companies, many consumers opted to go for the SG-1000. In their first year, Sega sold far more units than they had anticipated, beating out Nintendo. But worse than that, the initial wave of Famicom units had tons of technical problems, to the point that Uemura says that what he remembers the most about the Famicom was dealing with all of the complaints. It was a hard time for Nintendo and its employees for the first little while. One problem was that the controllers would become detached from the console, and there was no easy way to replace them. Another was the square buttons on the controllers getting stuck because people would press on them harder than the developers had anticipated. Eventually, they changed the square button design out for round ones so they wouldn't stick so easily. One of the worst issues was a faulty circuit being manufactured, which resulted in Nintendo having to recall thousands of Famicom units and replace them free of charge. Ultimately, this led to a lot of goodwill from consumers, but it hit Nintendo directly in the pocketbook and made it hard for Nintendo to keep up with demand. If all of that wasn't enough, the Famicom didn't really have any way to prevent anyone from making their own Famicom games, since the licensing business hadn't been established at this point. Just like the Atari in the US, as the Famicom gained popularity, more and more companies began releasing their own shitty games in order to make a quick buck, leading to less consumer confidence in Famicom games. However, despite all these problems, Nintendo forged ahead, and by the end of 1983 it had released 6 more games. First off, a couple of games for the older crowd. After all, this is the family computer, and Grandpa wants a fucking turn, goddammit! Gomoku Narabe Renju was a computer version of the classic game Gomoku, or Go. Apparently old Hiroshi Yamauchi was a big fan of this game in real life. Oh, and they also released Mahjong. Which sold nearly as many copies as Mario Bros. What? Speaking of Mario Bros., that game was released shortly after it hit arcades, and it was nearly identical to the arcade version, both graphically and gameplay-wise. I love this game, but I've already talked about it a bunch. This gave the Famicom a true simultaneous multiplayer experience, rather than switching off on Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr. Mario Bros. Was, of course, a huge hit with the Japanese Famicom owners, and it sold very well. If you want to hear all of my thoughts on it, go check out the video I made about it. I got to meet Mario and everything. He came and fixed my sink. At least I think it was him. Additionally, Shigeru Miyamoto had personally overseen the development of another game, Baseball, which was released in time for the holiday season. The game sold like hotcakes, becoming one of the best-selling Famicom games in Japan. The game doesn't really have much to offer for a gamer in 2023, but back in the day this was one of the best home video game experiences of baseball you could have. The last 2 games were educational versions of other Nintendo arcade games, an English learning game based on Popeye, and the infamous Donkey Kong Jr. Math. Check out my Donkey Kong Jr. video if you want to learn more about that one and how terrible I am at math. For its first year of game releases, it really seemed like Nintendo wanted something for everyone. You had your classic board games, a sports title, some educational outings, and the actual fun ones. After a very rocky start, Nintendo was finally gaining some traction, and by the end of its second year, Famicom sales had outpaced the SG-1000. Soon, Nintendo was releasing hit after hit with beloved classics like Ice Climber, Excite Bike, Pinball, Duck Hunt, and Balloon Fight, among many others. Of course, that was just the beginning. Only a few years later, Nintendo would change the history of video games forever, capturing the imagination of people worldwide and rocketing the company into superstardom with the release of a game featuring a certain mustachioed plumber. But that is a story for another day. Even though I didn't grow up with the Famicom and it's not my favorite Nintendo console, it still holds a strong place in my heart. I love these old 8-bit graphics, and I respect all of the strides the Famicom and NES games made in game development. I have memories of playing Donkey Kong at a friend's house when I was a kid. We had a Super Nintendo, but I remember being jealous and thinking it was really cool because there were no mushrooms, Mario was blue, and the background was all black. I also remember the first time I played the original Super Mario Bros. On the NES as a young teenager. I thought it was cool to see the original artwork instead of the updated graphics from the remakes that I was used to. It was in a creepy old guy's basement who I later learned was a child predator. Yikes! Compared to modern games, the controls of the Famicom can feel clunky, or the games can be unfair or really difficult. But many of the games are definitely worth playing, especially to see the foundations of modern gaming. You may not spend 40 hours playing, but you may be surprised at how fun and engaging these games can be. Many of the Famicom and NES games are pretty accessible these days too, depending on your budget. The best way, if you have a Nintendo Switch, is with an online subscription where you can get access to a huge catalog of NES games. And this is just the start of our journey into the life of the Famicom. At this point in our story, it would still be years before the US would be introduced to the Famicom under its US name, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Not to mention how the Famicom dominated the gaming world for over a decade, introducing the world to franchises like The Legend of Zelda, Mega Man, Metroid, Dragon Quest, Castlevania, Metal Gear, and so many others. So don't forget to subscribe, because we've got a ton of great Famicom games coming up on Friday Night Games. Now, before we get back to the Game & Watch series, we've got one more game to talk about. We're going back to the arcades for a little boxing action, so get your mind and body ready, because next time it's all about Nintendo's one-on-one combat classic, Punch-Out! This week's subscriber shoutout goes to Wolfgang Frost. Thank you so much for watching and commenting, it really means the world to me. You rock, Wolfgang Frost.